I first became interested in the topic of free will and the discussion surrounding whether or not we actually have it because of how consequential it seemed. Generally, you don't really think twice when inflicting judgment on people who have committed some pretty heinous crimes. When you see an unaliver getting convicted or a thief getting caught, we generally get a feeling of satisfaction or a sense that that person got what they deserved. That person is going to prison because they deserve to go to prison. They deserve to be punished. Why do they deserve to be punished? Well, because they did something bad. Now, it's pretty common to find debates or conversations surrounding whether or not we should try to rehabilitate criminals more so than just punishing them. But generally speaking, most people agree that such a criminal does deserve punishment because, well, they did something bad. Or rather, they chose to do something bad. And this distinction is important and obvious. We treat people who unalive someone differently based on whether they performed the act in self defense versus if it was maliciously premeditated. In the former example, the person either had little or no choice to perform the act, given that their life was at stake. The latter, however, chose to perform the act without a good reason, and because they chose to perform this act without a good reason, they deserve to be punished. Even if it were to be definitively proven somehow that this person, if let loose on society, would not commit any crimes whatsoever and just live a normal life, most of us still feel like they deserve punishment and shouldn't be let free. They've made their choice, we would say. They chose to do what they did. But what if they didn't choose? What if there actually isn't as big of a difference as we'd like to think between these two scenarios? If we live in a world where free will doesn't exist and people don't freely make their decisions, do we still punish people who did something bad in the past but won't do anything bad in the future? This debate really makes you marinate your thoughts on the concepts of blame and praise, punishment and reward, and the judicial system in its entirety. Throughout history, there have been scientific discoveries that have forced us to recontextualize our existence and understanding of the outside world, such as when we realized that the sun was at the center of the solar system and not the Earth, or when the germ theory of disease was firmly established, washing away the lingering remnants of illnesses spawning from demonic possessions. It makes you wonder if free will is the next casualty. And two philosophers, among many, that tackle this conundrum are Daniel Dennett and Gregg Caruso. Daniel Dennett was a philosopher whose topics of interest range from religion and naturalism to the philosophy of mind. He passed away a little over a year ago, but his work remains tremendously influential to this day. Gregg Caruso is also a philosopher, and he's the professor of ethics and the director of the Patrick J. Wade Center for Applied Ethics at Fairfield University. Both have spent stupendous amounts of time within the field of free will, but have arrived at different conclusions. In 2021, they published a written debate between them in the form of a book called Just Desserts, Debating Free Will. Throughout this video, I'm going to be doing my best to elucidate Daniel Dennett's and Gregg Caruso's positions on free will. I will be giving each party's positions and arguments as well as their counter-arguments. However, nothing compares to actually reading the book for yourself, so if you're interested, I will be providing the links to purchase the book in the description of the video below, and I legitimately recommend that you purchase it and read it for yourself since I won't be regurgitating every argument made in the book. I'm only going through the first part of the book. I'll probably cover the rest of the book in the future, but in this video, it's only going to be the first section. While I have my own beliefs about the matter that I will make clear as I comb through their arguments, I will be doing my best to represent both positions as fair and accurately as possible. And I say this in large part because much of this debate actually revolves around definitions. Defining free will isn't as straightforward as one would imagine, and this lack of an established definition is what causes so much discord. As I was reading the book, I was surprised by how, for entire sections, it would seem, Daniel Dennett and Caruso were just speaking past each other because they were both operating on different assumptions about what free will entailed. In fact, and I'm going to be completely honest and transparent here, it's semantics that caused me to be absolutely confused on Daniel Dennett's position on free will for God knows how many years. I listened to Dennett's debate with free will skeptics like Sam Harris. I listened to his speeches. I even read his book, Elbow Room, back in 2018, and I still didn't fully understand what his position really was. I knew the gist of it regarding a compatibilist defense of the aspects of free will worth preserving, aspects that don't entail or require determinism to be false. But when he was hit with counterarguments, I never understood his responses. They seemed so unsatisfying, not just because I disagreed with them, but because I didn't understand them. But after reading Just Desserts, I think I do now. It was about halfway through the book when it finally clicked and I had a light bulb moment. I'm sure others caught on much quicker than I did, but it was still so satisfying when it finally clicked in me what Dennett had been arguing for all those years. It felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders after finally understanding what the Dennett was saying. I'm pretty confident that I understand his position now, but it's possible that I don't. So if someone down there listens to what my characterization of Dennett's arguments are, and you think that I'm wrong, by all means, comment down below what I missed or what I unnecessarily added. The book is structured as if it's a transcript of an in-person debate. So you have a section where it's Caruso's writing and giving his argument, and then Dennett responding. So I'm going to try to summarize each side's arguments holistically and concisely. Anyways, I don't mean to blue ball you guys, so without further ado, let us begin. Let's go over some terms, or at least let's go over how these terms are generally defined by the philosophical community. I say this because Dennett, as we will see, is someone who prefers a different definition of free will than is generally accepted among philosophers, but we'll get into that later. Generally speaking, free will is viewed as the ability to make conscious decisions regardless of any external factors. A thought experiment generally used to better illustrate this goes as such. Imagine waking up one morning and sluggishly getting out of bed. You make your way to the kitchen to begin your morning routine, a routine that always starts off with either a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. On this particular morning, you chose to have a cup of tea instead of a cup of coffee. You finish up your tea and you go on about your day and finish up your routine. Now, the question that we must ask ourselves here is this. Could you have just as easily picked coffee instead of tea? You might be tempted to say, of course, but let's think about it for a minute. Everything in that situation remains the same. Your mental state is the same. Your cravings are the same. The time in which you got up is the same. The entire history of the universe is exactly the same. Are you sure that you could have picked otherwise? Those who answer no are said to be determinists. Per the book, determinism is the thesis that facts about the remote past in conjunction with the laws of nature entail that there is only one unique feature. So in our thought experiment, because everything about the state of the universe was exactly the same, it would have been impossible for you to have picked otherwise. You don't actually have the level of control over your own actions that you feel like you do. The people who answer yes, on the other hand, are generally called libertarians, which is not to be confused with the political philosophy, of course. But libertarians often invoke a soul of sorts to justify the ability to make decisions in a way that isn't constrained by naturalistic explanations of the universe. Now, when you poll people on their beliefs on free will, the overwhelming majority of the general public believes that free will would allow you to have picked otherwise. People who don't believe in free will often invoke the reality of determinism in order to help make their point, but that doesn't mean that determinism being true necessitates free will not being true. From here, we get the compatibilists, a sort of middle ground between the free will skeptics, as people who don't believe in free will are called, and those who do believe in free will. Compatibilists acknowledge that determinism is true, but believe that we can still have a working definition of free will that captures the essence or the important aspects of free will that we really care about. Unlike Caruso, this is where Dennett places himself. While Caruso believes that determinism is incompatible with free will, Dennett thinks otherwise. The free will topic becomes increasingly complicated when you introduce morality into the equation. Remember when I said that determinism would have prevented you from having picked coffee in the earlier thought experiment? Well, if our decisions are not truly ours in the conventional sense, and our actions and beliefs are dictated by the laws of physics and biology, then can we truly lay blame or praise on individuals if they couldn't have made different decisions? Many philosophers actually like to look at the free will question from the moral dimension, as it's ultimately the same thing but from a different lens. As Caruso states, we can say that free will, as contemporary philosophers tend to understand it, is the control and action required for a particular kind of moral responsibility. More specifically, it's the power or capacity characteristic of agents in virtue of which they can justly deserve to be blamed and praised, punished and rewarded for their actions. Understanding free will as linked to moral responsibility in this way anchors the philosophical debate in something comparatively concrete and undeniably important to our lives. So whereas in the original thought experiment, we were looking for the type of control that would have been completely independent of any physical or biological law that you have no control over, such that we can say that you created the decision-making thought in your head that caused you to pick coffee or tea. Here we're analogously looking for an action that you yourself made with no external influences that you have no control of in order for us to say that, yes, you truly do deserve praise or condemnation depending on what you did for your action. And again, we're not really talking about sociological factors, such as if you're born in an impoverished neighborhood, you're more likely to commit crime or whatever, at least not yet. Many philosophers use that as additional ammunition against free will, but generally speaking, again, at least for now, we're just talking about the laws of physics and biology that are already set in place since the beginning of the universe. Your entire future was already set in stone by the time you were born, and there's no stopping it. And if this is the case, then can we truly lay blame on people for doing bad things if they were always meant to? Can we truly praise people for grand achievements if their story was already written before they even knew anything about it? When we're putting someone on trial for unaliving someone, the punishment tends to be more severe if the act was done premeditatedly than if it was in self defense. After all, the person who committed the act in self defense likely had no choice. But there's no choice in anything that we do, at least not per the definition that most people subscribe to. So much like how we don't necessarily blame the person who unalived someone in self-defense, must we also not lay blame on the other person as well in order to remain logically consistent? And it's from this perspective, this moral framework, that the conversation about free will begins. The first contention we'll see between Gregg Caruso and Daniel Dennett is regarding what we mean by control and to what degree we can control our actions and beliefs. When Dennett talks about control and whether or not we, as humans, can exert control over ourselves, he uses a conception of control that is closer to the way the average person conceives it. Aside from the mentally disabled, we can control ourselves under all but the most extreme circumstances. And this difference is both morally important and obvious once you divorce the idea of control from the idea of causation. Your past does not control you. For it to control you, it would have to be able to monitor feedback about your behavior and adjust its interventions, which is nonsense. Then it seems to be arguing here that the fact that we can reason, deliberate, persuade, argue, and decide is a degree of control that we can be satisfied with. Much like how the average person doesn't think about the causal structure of the universe that dictates events happening based on the physical laws of the natural world, Dennett doesn't either. He acknowledges that those exist, but that its omission is not a necessary requirement for us to say that we have control over ourselves. And again, he is abiding by the definition of control that most people would agree with. So when you're deciding where to eat, what to do, what to say, what to think, you are controlling those actions and thoughts. Sure, you might be influenced by sociological factors such as biases that stem from your political or religious creeds, but you can, of course, correct for those things, or at least try to course correct for them. You have a level of control that can influence your actions and beliefs, and because we have this level of control, it's perfectly justifiable to lay blame on a criminal or levy praise upon an accomplished athlete. They controlled the factors that were available to them. Crusoe, on the other hand, believes that what we do and the way we are is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, and that because of this, we are never morally responsible for our actions in a particular but pervasive sense, the sense that would make us truly deserving of blame and praise, punishment and reward. For Caruso, because we do not control the factors that cause us to act and behave in the way that we do, because we lack that control that dictates our actions and beliefs, you can't lay blame or praise on someone for something that they did. And here, Caruso is operating on the notion of choice and free will that the average person walking down the street would abide by, and he is denying that we have that level of choice or decision-making abilities. Of course, we can make decisions or at least feel like we're making decisions, but the level of control that one anticipates someone has when you lay blame or praise onto them is a level of control that we don't actually have. The level of control that we have is closer to the level of control that we associate with the person that was acting in self-defense rather than the level of control that we associate with the person who acted in a premeditated manner. This level of control that Caruso expects would justify what is referred to as basic desert moral responsibility. Per the book, basic desert moral responsibility argues that for an agent to be morally responsible for an action in this sense is for it to be theirs in such a way that they would deserve to be blamed if they understood that it was morally wrong, and they would deserve to be praised if they understood that it was morally exemplary. The desert at issue here is basic in the sense that the agent would deserve to be blamed or praised just because they have performed the action, given an understanding of its moral status, and not, for example, merely by virtue of consequentialist or contractualist considerations. Whereas Dennett can look at this definition and say that yes, we do have basic desert moral responsibility because we can control our actions, again, using the general understanding of control. Gregg doesn't think that we can truly control said actions. As Gregg argues, I contend that retributive punishment is never justified since agents lack the kind of free will and basic desert moral responsibility needed to ground it. Gregg does acknowledge Daniel Dennett's point that we are sensitive to reasons and can make decisions based on the evidence presented to us. However, whereas Dennett argues that this gives us the kind of voluntary control necessary for free will and control, Gregg argues that The particular reasons that move us, along with the psychological predispositions, likes and dislikes, and other constitutive factors that make us who we are, themselves are ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And this remains true whether those factors include determinism, indeterminism, chance, or luck. So let's do a quick pulse check and lay down the positions of both parties. Both believe, or at least heavily lean towards, in a deterministic universe. When both are presented with the thought experiment regarding whether one could have done otherwise, both would argue that you could not have done otherwise. So on this question, they are aligned with each other. However, they are at odds with the general public, which I think is something that's worth noting. Gregg Caruso would obviously have an opinion that disagrees with the general public since he flat out rejects that we have free will, which is something that the vast majority of people do believe we have. However, even though Daniel Dennett does believe in free will, he is still at odds with the general public. Because when the general public is polled with the question regarding could someone have done otherwise, most people answer yes. Most people don't believe in, or are at least unaware of, a deterministic universe. But Dennett does believe in a deterministic universe, so his conception of free will is already going to be noticeably different than the general public's conception of free will. And this is a theme that will come up often, that the definition that Daniel Dennett gives free will is one that the general public doesn't share. And to Dennett's credit, he does acknowledge this, but simply, and in my opinion justifiably, argues that his definition of free will is a better one. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So far, we know that both Gregg Caruso and Daniel Dennett believe in a deterministic universe in which, given the question, you could not have done otherwise. However, while some argue that a deterministic universe necessarily means that you cannot be in control of your own actions, Dennett disagrees and says that the fact that you can reason and deliberate what you're going to do and form beliefs and opinions, the fact that you can do these decisions is more than enough. So what if we're just causal robots following a dictated path? You still feel like you're making decisions. You're still choosing to better yourself, to better understand the world. You're still choosing to work hard. You're still choosing to do things whose consequences you can anticipate. And thus, you make your decisions based off of that. And because of that, you should feel a certain way if your friend broke their promise to you. You should be upset and they should get blame. You do deserve that high paying tech job because you worked really hard for it. You scored better on the aptitude test than the rest of the candidates and impressed the recruiter more than anybody else there. You deserve that job. And that's basic deserve moral responsibility. You deserve the good thing because you earned it. You deserve the bad thing because you earned it. Not because of any reason other than you earned it. But Caruso disagrees. He believes that you don't even have the control you think you do when it comes to the examples that Dennett gives. It's not just that we live in a deterministic universe, but your environment and biology also remove any semblance of choice that you think you have. For example, you could argue that you won that race because you trained hard. You were a hard worker. But what made you a hard worker in the first place? Why were you born with the capacity to work hard while the others were born with a lower capacity? Why do you even have the desires that you have? You don't choose those desires. You don't choose anything. The only difference between the person who unalived someone in self-defense and the person who unalived someone indiscriminately is in the degrees of separation between the action and the cause of that action. But at no point in between any of those layers did you exhibit any level of control. And this doesn't even necessarily entail determinism. In fact, Caruso's main arguments against free will has less to do with determinism and more to do with these factors instead. However, Caruso does believe that moral responsibility can still be applied, but it has to be applied in a forward-thinking way that can include things like deterring future harm or rehabilitation. But he's just not convinced that the kind of desert Dan has in mind is enough to justify retributive punishment. For us to be truly deserving of blame and punishment in a way that abides by what the average person thinks is legitimate and is logically consistent, you need much more control. Now, Dennett actually agrees with Caruso in disavowing retributive punishment and views it as an archaic approach to judicial matters if the primary goal is to punish people for their misdeeds rather than any level of rehabilitation. But he argues that you can reject this view of punishment while still giving backward-looking reasons for punishments. Now, this is where I start to get confused about Dennett's position, because in Caruso's eyes, as well as mine, what is being rejected here is the idea that people deserve to be punished and rewarded without any regard for the consequences. We should punish people because it deters future bad behavior, and we hope that the perpetrator can be rehabilitated. We reject the notion that people truly deserve blame for their actions because there is no significant difference between the lack of control that someone who was forced to do something bad out of fear for their life versus someone who did something bad because they felt like they wanted to. We don't believe in free will, at least not the type of free will that most people believe in. And because of that, we can't justify punishing people because we think they deserve it without any regard for future consequences. So for us, any type of backward looking punishment cannot be justified because backward looking punishments exclusively factor out future consequences. It's not about punishing someone because society will be better off in the future for it. It's about punishing someone because, well, they deserve it. And Dennett agrees that punishing someone just because they deserve it is wrong. We shouldn't do that. But then he says that we can still justify backward looking punishments. So maybe there's actually something that we didn't think about. Maybe there are backward looking punishments that are justifiable, but don't resort to simple, you deserved it justifications. But no, he uses as an example blaming a friend for breaking a promise with no good excuse. Your friend promised that he was going to do something and he broke that promise for a stupid reason. Let's say that he knew he had to pick you up at the airport, but he wanted to play video games instead. Now, you can and should blame this person. This is backwards looking because we are instilling blame on someone for something that they did in the past because, and I quote him, all of us depend on being able to count on them. It is for this reason that among their responsibilities is preserving their status as autonomous agents, guarding against the usurpation or manipulation of their own powers of discernment and decision. So we can't blame them for being duped, for getting drunk, etc. When we blame them, we are not just diagnosing them or categorizing them, we are holding them deserving of negative consequences. If this isn't basic dessert, then so much the worse for basic dessert. What is it supposed to add to this kind of dessert? I don't know, Daniel. Maybe something that doesn't entail future consequences as your justification for backward looking punishment? And then he then uses rules in soccer as another example as to why backward looking punishments are necessary. The punishment is relatively mild because it's only a game. But if the transgression is serious enough, large fines can be assessed, or banishment from the game. And of course, criminal prosecution for assault or cheating also lurks in the wings. Free will skeptics should consider if they would abolish all these rules because the players don't have free will. And if they would grant a special exemption for such penalties in sport, what principle would they cite for not extending the same policies to the much more important game of life? It sounds like to him, backward looking punishments just mean punishments inflicted upon someone based on things that they have already done, which me and Caruso have no problem with. Retributive justice, though, is about inflicting punishment that is proportional to the crime, regardless of future consequences. This is what it means to get one's just desserts. It's not about deterring bad behavior, nor is it a part of some utilitarian calculation. It's just what it says it is, punishing people because they deserve it. It's the type of moral code that you would see in religious texts, but our contention is that when you break it down and analyze the world scientifically and philosophically, this view of ethics is at odds with what we see and how we understand the world. So Dennett is doing a few things here that are disagreeable to me and Caruso so far. He does believe that people do deserve to be blamed and rewarded for the things that they've done before, but not for the same reasons that the average person would say. Someone should be blamed or punished or rewarded because when we do that, we are changing behaviors that we do or do not like. You're blaming your friend for breaking their promise because they shouldn't be doing stuff like that. You are penalizing a soccer player for a careless tackle, so players don't just go running around making careless tackles unless you're the Saudi national team. But these sound an awful lot like forward looking reasons, and when Caruso confronts Dennett on this, Dennett is insistent that he's not using consequentialist reasoning to justify applying blame or praise on someone. I mean, am I losing my mind? Is the Alzheimer's getting to me already? What the is he saying? Like all these years of not understanding Dennett's position, I don't even know if I disagree with him because I don't understand his position. But then something magical happened. As I continued to read Dennett's defense, I realized two things. The first is that Dennett just sucks at explaining his position on free will. I don't know what it is, but he's just not very good at it. I'm sorry. But I got it now. I know what he's trying to say. And yes, you guessed it, it's just semantics. So here's what I'm pretty confident that Dennett's position is. If you're looking at civilization from the outside and you have the power to change and structure it, you do want ethical frameworks to be constructed based on consequentialist reasoning. So, what rules, expectations, and incentives you create are done so because you think they have the highest likelihood of producing the most desirable outcomes. This includes having a society that believes in free will. Not free will in the libertarian sense, where they have to think that they have a soul or something, but a belief that people should be rewarded for good things and should be punished for bad things. This is largely in line with my personal view, which is a consequentialist version of punishment and blame, where people are still punished for doing bad things, but the focus is on rehabilitation and minimizing undesirable future consequences. However, where he deviates is when you change your position from being on the outside looking into society and being inside of society itself. Dennett believes that in order for this to reliably produce the results that we want, you do actually have to believe it. Or at least you have to act like you believe it. When Caruso talks about whether or not people truly deserve something, he's doing so without regard for consequentialist reasons. But even though it certainly sounds like Dennett is doing the opposite, he actually isn't. Dennett and Caruso are talking past each other without anybody even knowing. It's why I couldn't understand Dennett's position for all these years. Dennett's bedrock for justifying blame is to just point at the bad action and say the person who committed it deserves blame. It's almost like he's saying, that's how it's defined, and so that's what it literally is. And when it gets brought up that you can only justify this with consequentialist reasons, Dennett doesn't really disagree. He seems to just get annoyed and go like, sure, I guess, yeah. But he's not disagreeing. To us, it sounds like he's contradicting himself, but he's actually not. Dennett is arguing within the framework, whereas Gregg is arguing outside of it. Dennett states that the sense of deserve that I defend is the everyday sense in which, when you win the race fair and square, you deserve the blue ribbon or gold medal. And if you wrote the novel, you deserve the royalties. And if you plagiarized it, you don't. And if you knowingly park in a no parking zone, you deserve a parking ticket. And if you refuse to pay it, you deserve some escalated penalty, and if you committed the premeditated unaliving, you deserve to go to prison for a very long time, provided, in all cases, that you are a responsible agent, a member in the Moral Agents Club, as I have called it. Of course, it is the forward looking benefits of the whole system of desert that justifies it, but it justifies the system while ruling out case by case considerations of the specific benefits or lack thereof accruing to any particular instance of blame or punishment, which is not true of therapy, for instance. The system specifically prohibits even raising the issue of whether, in this instance, more good than harm would result from abandoning the verdict and the penalty. It seems like Dennett is justifying following a virtue based moral system on rule utilitarian grounds. And so when Dennett talks about desert, he is saying it in the literal everyday sense and believes this should be the main definition. That's why he emphasized earlier about divorcing our understanding of control from causation. But in order for the framework to actually work as intended, you do have to believe in this version of free will that Dennett is defending. You do have to believe, and Dennett does believe, he isn't pretending, that people deserve to be rewarded and deserve to be punished based on their actions. But much like we don't say that a team that wins a game doesn't deserve it because the universe is deterministic and the players can't control their desires or whatever, we shouldn't do that for free will either. I mean, I'm a big fan of soccer and I don't do that. When I'm watching Mexico lose again, I'm not thinking about the uncontrollable structure of the universe and the timeline of events that dictated that they would lose again. I'm not in that mode. I'm just thinking that Mexico lost because they suck and they need to do a better job to win future games. Obviously, the deterministic and free will skeptic arguments are true. Yes, like all of that is technically true. But I'm not operating in that framework. And Dennett isn't either when he talks about free will. I actually don't know if I would have pieced this together if it weren't for the physicist Sean Carroll's written defense of compatibilism that I remember reading a few years back, where he likens free will to the rules of baseball. Much like you don't talk about baseball in reference to the position and quantity of the particles that constitute the ball, or the standard model of particle physics, or the neurochemistry within the brains of the players, we don't and shouldn't talk about free will in that manner either. So Dennett isn't lying or changing his position or even being deceptive at all when it sounds like he's contradicting himself. He's actually totally being logically consistent. The way he is speaking is consistent with his real beliefs. And I don't think Caruso is doing a bad job at facilitating the conversation or anything. He actually does a really good job of being charitable and ensuring that Dennett is giving ample space and time to lay out his position. It could be a generational thing, or it could just be that this happens to be one of those topics where it's so very, very, very hard to talk about it without talking past each other. I'm not sure. But regardless, in theory, these are their positions, and we can finally start actually addressing their real disagreements. Dennett is defending the concept of just desserts and free will because he believes that, on average, it produces the best type of society. Is it a redefinition? Sure, but as we stated previously, he acknowledges this and says that it's best to just view these terms as he argues them rather than just throwing them away, which I think is fine. Definitions often change over time as people use certain words differently. Language tends to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. Caruso disagrees and argues that not only that the type of control that Dennett says we have isn't enough control to justify just desert moral responsibility, but also that the way in which we perceive and view free will and just desert moral responsibility, it causes more harm than good. And this is going to take us to the second part of the book, which I will be discussing in a future video, so stay tuned for that. But anyways, that's all for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I do plan on making more of these types of philosophy and science videos in the future. I'm currently working on an analysis of the philosophy behind the Starship Troopers book by Robert Heinlein. My dog's actually been helping a little bit, as you can see. Haven't you? Haven't you? Anyways, besides that, I'm also working on a video on Jonathan Rauch's book, Cross Purposes, where he launches a defense of Christianity being intermingled with liberal democracies, as well as the book that he wrote before that called The Constitution of Knowledge. So, besides that, I'm still working out the kinks regarding what other videos to make, so we'll figure that out together maybe. Anyways, see you guys in the next video, maybe, and I hope everyone has a great day.